Hello my lovelies, I hope you're all well. Today we are going to be talking about an amazingly incredible case about a lady called Alison Botha. No disrespect is ever intended against anyone mentioned in my videos or any relatives, descendants of anyone mentioned. And just as a side note, my videos are not suitable for children. We are talking about true crime stories. There will be descriptions of crime scenes, injuries, and all that stuff, which is not suitable for minors. Okay, our story begins in 1994 in South Africa. In 94, Alison was 27 years old and she was living in Port Elizabeth in South Africa. Port Elizabeth is a large-ish city. Alison was working as an insurance broker after spending several years travelling around. She'd moved back home to South Africa, which her mum was very happy about because she was home and safe after spending some years travelling around the world. She had returned home. She'd settled into her own apartment and was working as an insurance broker, which was a job that she was thoroughly enjoying. On the 18th of December, Alison had had a really lovely day with her friends. They had spent all afternoon at the beach, and then in the evening they had gone back to Alison's apartment where they had ordered pizza and they had played games together and everyone was just having a great time. So as the night wore on, Alison's friends went home and she had offered to give a lift to her friend and pick up her laundry from her friend's house. So this was about 1 AM on the Sunday morning now when she got back to her apartment. As she drove down the street, her usual convenient parking space directly outside of her apartment had been taken, so she had to drive a little bit further down the street to find somewhere to park. She found a spot a little bit further down. It was a pretty dimly lit street, but she found a parking space, so she was happy. As she switched the engine off and reached across to get her clean laundry, her car door was opened, and as she looked, there was a man standing directly outside her car door with a knife, and he told her to move over or he would kill her. So she did. She moved across to the passenger seat. The man, who introduced himself as Clinton, climbed into the driver's seat and he drove away with Alison in the passenger seat. Now, she was obviously terrified, but Clinton had promised not to hurt her, and he said he just needed to borrow her car for an hour or so. He had a friend that owed him some money, so he was going to drive, get his money, and then he would let her go. Alison was a person who liked to believe the best in people, and as much as she was terrified, she trusted that he meant what he said. So she didn't attempt to run or get away. And, you know, he was being friendly and engaging in conversation and obviously kept assuring her that she wasn't going to be hurt. They drove around the city. Clinton he saw the person that he was looking for and he pulled the car over and this person got into the back seat. The man who had just got in the car, he referred to as Tians. As Alison looked at the man in the back seat, her feeling of dread increased as she said that his eyes were just dead and he just looked evil. The three drove through the city into the outskirts where it was completely deserted, and this is when Alison said that she knew that she was going to die. What happens next is honestly one of the most horrific and violent attacks that I've ever heard of. The two men told Alison that they would have sex with her and they asked if she was going to fight back. Alison didn't know how to fight, and honestly, with it being 2 against 1, she didn't know if she would even be able to get away, so she said no, she wouldn't fight. They each took turns to rape Alison. First went Franz, the man who had called himself Clinton, but she now knew his name was Franz, as Tiens called him by his name. So Franz raped her first, and then Tiens raped her. It was whilst Tiens was raping Alison that he began to strangle her. And he strangled her until she lost consciousness. Alison was then stabbed upwards of 37 times, mostly located in the abdomen and pubic area, although there was some stab wounds to her chest as well. The two men realised that she was still alive, and this is when Tiens began to slash at her throat. In total, her throat was cut 17 times. Franz did also cut her throat. And then they left Alison to die. She heard the two men walking away, their footsteps getting quieter, and then she heard them drive off. At this moment, she said that she felt like she was dying, and all she could do was think, how am I going to make sure that these men never get to do this to anyone else? So in the dirt, she wrote Franz and Tiens, and then she also wrote, I love Mum. At this point, Alison said that she felt herself leave her body, and she felt like she was floating above the scene. In this moment, she decided that she wanted to live. She wanted to fight. She wanted to survive. She wanted to live her life better. You know, she had friends, she had family, and she wanted to live for them. As she returned to her body, she heard the rattling breathing noise from her throat, which had been cut. She felt something wet at her legs, and this is when she realised that she had in fact been disemboweled and that her intestines were out of her body. She grabbed her nearby shirt to hold her intestines in place and she began to crawl through the dirt. It didn't take long for her to realise that this crawling was not going to work. And with this, she attempted to pull herself up to a standing position. As she stood, suddenly everything went black, and she realised as she reached her hand up to her throat, her entire hand went into the wound. They had in fact cut through so much of her muscle that her head had flopped backwards between her shoulder blades. So now she was holding her intestines in place with one hand, and she was having to pull her head up so that she could see using her other hand. And in this position, she then began walking back to the road. Amazingly, she made it back to the road. She managed to walk, holding her body in place, back to the main road. And this was where she collapsed. She collapsed on the main road. As she lay in the road, she saw a car approaching, and she had a fleeting thought that maybe this was Franz and Tiens in this car, but she realised that there was literally nothing she could do. If it was them, then it was them. If she got run over, then she got run over. But she had made it this far, and so she was just laying in the road. As the car approached, it slowed, and then, incredibly, drove away. The car drove away. A second car approached, and luckily this car did stop. The driver was a veterinary student, and he and his friends were in Port Elizabeth on holiday. Luckily, one of the group had a mobile phone with them. Again, this was 1994, so not everybody had a mobile phone at this point. The driver held onto Alison's hand and was just trying to keep her alive. You know, he was just saying to her, come on, stay with us. And Alison said, her being a people pleaser, she wanted to stay alive for him. So they called for an ambulance, and amazingly it took over 40 minutes for the ambulance to arrive, but it finally did. And the driver of the car, the veterinary student, he actually travelled in the ambulance with Alison, and it was only when they got to the hospital and she was taken in for her assessment that he let go of her hand. He'd been holding her hand the whole time. The driver said that after this encounter, he decided to become a doctor. So now at the hospital, this was when the real fight began for Alison. And the doctor stated that he had never seen such ferocious injuries, and he said it was just pure savage, the attack on Alison. And it still haunts him to this day. Alison's throat had been cut from ear to ear. Her trachea had been completely cut through. She was actually breathing through a gaping hole above her collarbones. Alison had been completely disemboweled, and her intestines were massively contaminated with sand and dirt and other foreign objects from where she had crawled through the dirt. Their examination of her injuries made it evident that it was unlikely that Alison would ever be able to be a mother. The surgeon was very meticulous when it came to cleaning out Alison's intestines. He even had to use a scrubbing brush in places to remove the debris. That first night in hospital, Alison's doctor actually stayed with her in intensive care. He didn't want to leave her side. And then it was in the early morning that the police arrived at the hospital to talk to Alison. The police had with them a folder full of pictures of suspects. And as Alison looked through the pictures, she first came to a picture of Franz, and she nodded and she wrote Franz down on the paper. And then she did exactly the same when she reached the picture of Tians. Later that day, the officers returned to the hospital and they had some news. The chief prosecutor had said that the case would be a lot stronger if Alison was able to verbalise the names of her attackers. Now, Alison had a tube in her throat at this time, which was helping her to breathe. There was a possibility that removing the tube would compromise the suture in her trachea, but the doctor asked Alison what her opinion of what this was and explained the situation to her, and this incredible woman wrote down, "Take it out." Once the tube was removed, Alison was able to say, "My attackers were Franz and Tians." It was after this that Alison was discharged from intensive care back into the general surgeon ward. And this was where her friends and family were able to visit her, and they were obviously shocked by her appearance, but Alison told them not to cry, and she actually said to her friends, "Look, I didn't even crack a nail," which obviously wasn't true. Her nails were wrecked. Once discharged from hospital, Alison still had to return to the hospital every single day for daily treatments to her injuries, mostly their abdomen, because they had to keep scraping the skin back to encourage new cell growth. And she would later need plastic surgery also. It turned out that there were actually previous rape victims of Franz and Tians. I believe Franz had 2 previous rape charges against him, and Tians had 1. When Franz was brought in by the police, he was actually very, very shocked when they told him that he was being arrested for attempted murder, because he was obviously under the impression that Alison had died. So, you know, the police officer had said he'd never seen someone so shocked before when they'd been told that they were being arrested for attempted murder. It was after he learned that Alison was still alive that he lifted up his hand, removed a ring from his finger and handed it to the officer, saying, "This is Alison's." Now, this ring still had blood on it, which they examined, and it was found to be Alison's blood. Alison would have to do an identity parade to pick out her attackers. At that time, the law in South Africa was that you would have to be in the same room as the people on parade, and the victim would have to put their hand on the shoulder of the suspect to indicate that they had picked this person out of the parade. The officer in charge of this case knew that that would be too much for Alison and completely unacceptable in this situation for her to do that. So they put a one-way glass in place so that she would be behind the glass and she could just tell them the number of the people that attacked her. So that's what they did. Alison was still petrified even though the glass was in place, so it was a really good thing that this officer managed to do that and didn't demand that she put her hand on the shoulder of the men who had raped and tried to kill her. She easily picked out Frans and Tiens from among the other men on the parade, even though they had changed their appearance prior to this. Frans's testimony in court was that he was a Satanist. He tried to use this as an excuse, but it was actually deemed to be a ploy by him. He didn't actually know anything about Satanism. Frans's father ended up committing suicide 2 years later because he could never come to terms with what his son had done. Both Frans and Tiens were sentenced to life in prison, and the judge has said that had the death penalty been an option, that he probably would have imposed the death penalty on these men. As it happens, they both received life sentences. I believe Frans was given 3 life sentences without parole, and Tiens was given 1 life sentence, 25 years without parole. But the judge did put a note on this, that these men should never be released because they were a danger to society. As they were led away, Tiens smacked his hand on the wall and shouted, "So here I go, F you all." Alison moved back in with her mother, who could help her with her wounds, and at first she needed to have sponge baths, like bed baths. So her mother was able to help her with this. She said, you know, her friends all had lives of their own to be getting on with. Luckily, her mother, who was single at the time, she was no longer with Alison's father, was able to just dedicate her life to helping Alison recover. Unfortunately, she did develop depression, and there was a time when she almost gave up. You know, this incredible lady who had survived all of this, you know, her physical injuries and everything, and all of the recovery, the physical recovery, she almost gave up with depression. She reminded herself that at the time of her attack, she chose life. And this is what basically got her through this. And also she was given the opportunity to do some public speaking about what had happened to her and the ordeal that she'd gone through. And she previously had been terrified of speaking in public, but this actually helped her massively to get over her depression because she was helping people. Alison also wrote a book about what happened to her, and she started a documentary about her ordeal. Now, remember I said that the judge had said that these men should never leave prison, and they were given no parole as part of their sentence. Well, unbelievably, as of 2015, these men are eligible for parole. I know. At the moment, neither of them has gained parole, which is obviously a bonus, but the possibility that they could has also damaged Alison's mental health. Turns out Frans is actually in an online relationship as well with somebody, and apparently he has many profiles on Facebook, and you know, he's very active on the internet, which is lovely, isn't it? I would like to end this on a positive note and tell you that Alison was able to become a mother. She conceived 2 boys naturally and was able to carry them to term. You know, she'd been very worried that all of her scar tissue and everything, that even if she could conceive, that there would be problems with her carrying to term, but she was able to do it with both her boys. And even though her marriage didn't last, she has her boys, and they'll keep her going. She still does public speaking today. As I said, she has her book, she has her documentary, which I suggest you go and watch. It's just called Alison, and she's just a very inspirational woman. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please comment down below if there's any cases that you would like to hear me cover, and I will see you soon.